Good morning. Now, I want to first of all tell all of our guests that I am informed by my communications director that there are many, many more people in the press corps here because we're live streaming this. And they're participating through live streaming, and that's so we can socially distance. So I want to thank those of you who are here, those of you who are watching us, and thanking and welcoming the Mayor, Madam Governor. Good to have you here. President of the Senate, Mr. Mendelson, otherwise known as President of the City Council. And, of course, I want to thank everybody for their participation. This has been an effort, as some of you know, long-standing. I am from Maryland. The Speaker is from Maryland. In 1788, Maryland gave this piece of property for our nation's capital. In 1789, Virginia ceded land. And in 1790, the U.S. accepted that land. And then in 1800, the seat of government became the District of Columbia. And I mention that because all of the citizens that were then living in that ceded land had a vote for the federal legislature. And then they lost it. They lost it as a result of actions that were not taken to ensure that the people of the District of Columbia would have the rights of every one of their fellow United States citizens. I've served with Walter Fauntleroy, who was the second delegate. The first was a person named Norton. That was his first name, not his last name. But he would be very proud of the fact that Eleanor Holmes Norton has fought this fight for a very long time. I have joined her in seeking representation for the District of Columbia, having a vote in the Congress of the United States. But I knew that statehood would be difficult. And so it took me some time to conclude that the only way we were going to give the citizens of the District of Columbia their right as American citizens was to support statehood. The Speaker and I have agreed on that for a long period of time, that the District of Columbia citizens were not being treated fairly. Over the past few weeks, we saw further examples of why the District of Columbia's lack of representation in Congress is so damaging. First, Senate Republicans insisted on treating D.C. as a territory, not a state, for the purpose of allocating emergency coronavirus response funding under the CARES Act. Now, I mention that because that's an immediate impact of disparate treatment of the District of Columbia. By the way, in 1902, Senator Gallagher, a Republican from New Hampshire, introduced a resolution to make D.C. a state. At that point in time, the District of Columbia was larger than 6 states in the Union. And in 1961, they received the vote for President of the United States and 3 Electoral College votes. They were then larger than 11 states in the Union. Now, the states have grown in population. The District of Columbia has as well, but it is larger than 2 states in the Union. Neither of those states, I haven't asked them personally, but I'm sure that when I asked them, do you want to be like the District of Columbia and not have a senator, 2 senators, and a member of the House because you're so small? What do you think the reaction would be, Eleanor? Hell no. That's why this action that we're taking on Friday, the 26th, is so very important. We're going to put this bill on the floor, Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill, that is co-sponsored by over 220 members of the House of Representatives. The shortchanging that I referred to initially endangers those living in the suburban communities of Maryland and Virginia as well, 2 states. Why? Because they come into the District of Columbia. And to the extent we underfund their response to COVID-19, we not only risk the citizens of Virginia and Maryland, but the entire nation. This is their capital. This is where they come to visit. This is where they come to see their government in action. And Mayor Bowser and the council are responsible for making sure this is a safe place to be. Later, as many protested peacefully for justice and policing, and to make it clear that Black Lives Matter, and Madam Mayor and Council, congratulations for Black Lives Matter Plaza. You and I had the opportunity to visit there Thursday and see the handiwork, not only of your Public Works Department, but from the people who were demonstrating on behalf of Black Lives Matter, joining in the painting that night. Yes. How impressive. Yes. If D.C. were a state, it could not be shortchanged as it was under the CARES Act, and its residents would be protected from the kind of civil rights violations we saw in Lafayette Square. All for the purpose of a photo op. This is not just an issue of local governance and fairness, it is a major civil rights issue as well. We must bring to an end to the disenfranchisement of 700,000 American citizens, more than Wyoming, more than Vermont, and very analogous to 2 other states. I have been a strong supporter, and I'm a strong supporter of D.C. statehood, because, as I said earlier, I have concluded that is the only way to recognize the citizens, the American citizens of the District of Columbia. We are the only nation, free nation in the world whose capital does not have voting members of their parliament. Today, I'm proud to announce, as I said a little earlier, I will be bringing this bill to the floor on Friday, June 26th for a vote. And I want to remember my friend and a great leader of this country, Elijah Cummings. It was he who presided over the hearing, Eleanor, on your bill. He's no longer with us. And Carolyn Maloney could not be with us today, but she presided on the vote, which reported that bill out of committee. And now I am bringing it to the floor. Speaker and I talked last week. We both agreed this was an appropriate time to bring a bill forward to show respect for the citizens of the District of Columbia of whatever color, but also to show respect to a city who has a very large African-American population. And they matter, and they ought to be treated equally, with respect. And that's what we're going to do. So I'm pleased to now recognize an extraordinary lady with whom I have served for a very long period of time, and I've known for a long period of time, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leader, for bringing us together this morning for this important occasion in American history. You began with the history of our country. I will proceed in that manner as well. Our Constitution begins with the beautiful preamble, "We the people," setting out our founders' vision of a government of, by, and for the people of the United States. Yet, for more than 2 centuries, the residents of Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, have been denied their right to fully participate in their democracy. Instead, they have been dealt the injustice of paying taxes, proudly serving in uniform in great numbers, and contributing to the economic power of our nation while being denied the full enfranchisement, which is their right. And in recent days, we have seen a disturbing physical manifestation of that injustice when federal agents and out-of-state National Guard troops were deployed against peaceful protesters in the district without residents' approval. For these and other reasons spelled out very specifically by the distinguished House Democratic leader, Mr. Hoyer, I am pleased to join my colleague, the leader Hoyer, and Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton as we prepare to fight an historic injustice by passing legislation to finally grant the District of Columbia statehood. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton has been a patron saint of D.C. statehood since she came to Congress, and she has built an historic support for the statehood bill. About a few weeks ago we were gathered in the Capitol because it was the 100-year anniversary of the House of Representatives granting women the right to vote. This year, it was the 101. It was 101. This year, we'll observe the 100th anniversary of the completion of it, but that that bill began the process, 101 years. I mentioned that because that day we came together and honored Eleanor Holmes Norton for the leader that she has been for women's rights in our country, but also because of the vote that she does not have, that she must have, and that we are gathering to correct today. So in every way about the vote, historically, for women, for the District of Columbia, Eleanor Holmes Norton has been a guiding star to all of us. And from Washington, what an honor it is for us to welcome the very distinguished Mayor, Muriel Bowser. She has made us all so very, very proud with her distinguished courage and eloquence about justice. And just when she speaks, she tells why the District of Columbia should be a state. We're pleased to welcome her always, Madam Mayor. Council President Mendelson, welcome to you as well. I look forward to your remarks. Senator, good to see you here as well. I just want to say this. This is personal for me. When I was born, my father was a member of Congress from Baltimore, Maryland. He was the chairman of the District of Columbia Appropriations Subcommittee, which in those days made him the unofficial mayor of Washington because of the authority that that committee had over the District of Columbia. He did not agree with that. He was a big proponent of home rule, so I like to say that statehood for the District of Columbia is in my DNA from my father. And that's why I take a personal interest in this as well as an official interest. This deprivation of statehood is unjust, unequal, undemocratic, and unacceptable. That is why next week, as Steny, distinguished leader, has said, H.R. 51, write that down, H.R. 51, Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton's Washington, D.C. Admission Act to admit the state of Washington, Douglas Commonwealth, into the Union, to use the full name. This will be historic. It will be an historic vote. Neither chamber of Congress has yet passed the statehood bill until next week, and we will continue our work to protect every American's right to be heard at the ballot box and on the floor of the House and of the Senate. And now it is my honor to yield to the distinguished author of the resolution, leader in our country on voting rights for all, starting with the District of Columbia, Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton. Over there. I'll go over here.
Thank you, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, our Mayor, Muriel Bowser, our Council Chair, whose titles are soon to be changed, and our Statehood Senator Paul Strauss, whose job it is to lobby for statehood for the District of Columbia. I very much appreciate the remarks of my two colleagues who have spoken. Each has been in the Congress somewhat longer than I, and none of us have seen equality in representation for the residents of the District of Columbia. So this is historic for them as well. We have, all three of us, served most of our time in the House in the minority. What you see here, for we have been in the majority only one term, is that the very first time we attained the majority in many years, our leadership has brought forward a bill that I have been introducing ever since I came to Congress, H.R. 51, the D.C. Statehood Bill. And as Steny Hoyer, Leader Hoyer, announced today that the bill would go to the floor, do understand that almost no bills are going to the floor this year. The virus has checked the ability of the Congress of the United States to put bills on the floor, except for those that are necessary for the country to proceed at all, such as our appropriation bills. So I am very grateful for the priority that our own leadership has given this bill. And I want to announce that this morning I saw on my Twitter that there were three new senators who have come onto the bill. I don't have them off the top of my head. Senator Stabenow, Senator Tester, and there's a third one. Who? And Senator Peters. You see, therefore, that today's announcement, Speaker Pelosi and Leader Hoyer, is gathering the momentum even in the Senate. My friends, it is surely worth noting, as our country prepares to celebrate its own birth as a nation on July 4th, that the House of Representatives will acknowledge just before that, on June 26th, the equal citizenship of the residents of their nation's capital by voting for statehood for the District of Columbia. And when I say voting for statehood for the District of Columbia, I say for and not on, because this bill already has more than enough co-sponsors for the bill to pass on June 26th. That is unusual. Most bills don't have so many co-sponsors. There are a few co-sponsors, and of course the leadership knows before the bill goes to the floor that the bill will pass. But we have redoubled our efforts to allow people to, or to ask people to proudly sponsor this bill and assure its passage. The significance, first and foremost, of this bill going to the floor is for the residents of the nation's capital who have worked for 219 years for this imprimatur, opening the path to all elements and the full meaning of citizenship. For me, today is also personal, not because I am the author of the bill. It is personal because 3 generations of my family have yet to attain the rights other Americans take for granted. The D.C. Statehood Bill will always have a personal acknowledgement for me of Richard Holmes, my great-grandfather, who escaped as a slave from a Virginia plantation. Richard Holmes made it as far as the District of Columbia, a walk to freedom, but not to equal citizenship. For the first time, statehood will put an end to our oldest slogan, taxation without representation. To crown that denial, D.C. residents pay the highest federal taxes per capita in the United States without equal representation. Coming in this, the third century of our nation, however, statehood means much more to us than dollars and cents. Statehood is priceless. Statehood assures that living in the nation's capital is about pride, not prejudice. Thanks to our leaders for your work in making June 26 become a historic day in the history of our country. Thank you very much. You want to introduce the woman?
When she ran for mayor, I called her up. And there was a little bit of a controversy, and I don't involve myself in the politics of the District of Columbia. But I called her up and said, I want to be for you. I've watched you. I've heard you. You are a leader that the district needs. And she has made that so true. And we are so proud of the mayor of the state to be a Frederick Douglass, a son of Maryland, and George Washington, a son of Virginia. The mayor of the District of Columbia, Muriel Bowser.
Well, good morning, everybody. I always start every press conference by saying I'm Muriel Bowser. I'm the mayor of Washington, D.C., and soon to be the 51st state. I start off that way because I am more proud to be able to represent 700,000 Washingtonians and to be the leader of my hometown than just about anything. The only thing that makes me prouder is being Miranda's mother, and I want her to grow up in a place where she can aspire to be the senator of the 51st state. I am so grateful to you, Mr. Leader, to you, Madam Speaker, and of course to our Congresswoman who has worked tirelessly on advancing D.C. statehood for her entire tenure. Some people think that that's all that the Congresswoman would have time to do, but she has also made sure that she has attracted jobs and development and focused on the things that makes life and the economy in Washington, D.C. hum. And she has done that with such extraordinary leadership. We are grateful to you, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. And Mr. Leader, I also want to acknowledge that during this, over the last several years, as we have been advancing the Tennessee plan for Washington, D.C. statehood, your commitment and your endorsement of the Congresswoman's bill has meant so much to us. And we have been able to count now the residents of Maryland and Virginia and their delegations, the Democrats for sure, in support of D.C. statehood. And that has also helped advance this cause that we're on today. The Congresswoman has achieved so many co-sponsors for this bill, more than in the history of our fight for D.C. statehood. And the Democrats supporting us in the Senate means so much. I was so appreciative when Senator Stabenow called me over the weekend to tell me that she too was proud that Washington, D.C. was fighting back and that it was very clear to her the injustice being done in D.C., and that statehood was the only real cure to that injustice. We, too, are grateful to Congresswoman Maloney for advancing the vote, and all of the members of Congress who came out in support to speak about the truth of Washington, D.C. I have had the privilege over the last 10 days to represent, I guess it's been 14 days now, to represent Washington, D.C. against what we as Americans know was happening in our city, and that it wasn't right. It violated our principles of Americans being able to peacefully protest, and it violated our principles of local autonomy. And what Americans saw, people who never thought about Washington, D.C., or who was in charge or who was doing what, were calling and texting and saying what is happening is not right. There shouldn't be troops from other states in Washington, D.C. There shouldn't be federal forces advancing against Americans. And there very definitely shouldn't be soldiers stationed around our city waiting for the go to attack Americans in a local policing matter. So they knew now that our cause for statehood is certainly about making sure we have 2 voting senators to speak up for us, and making sure that our Congresswoman has a vote, and making sure that we have seats at the table when the governors and state legislatures are talking. But what they also saw was it's just a chick mayor from Washington, D.C. having to fight an army, and that the United States of America wanted to be with us. And so we know that statehood is the only way to ensure that we have full representation, that we have votes here in the United States of America, in the Capitol, but also to make sure that we're fully autonomous. And that is our birthright. And that is what this bill will ensure. So I couldn't be more grateful at a time, especially when this Congress is challenged with being able to meet and advance the important measures before us, that we are included in that we are a priority. And I have to say, Madam Speaker, who has been such a source of just strength for our entire nation, but also for us. To think that you would make the time to call me throughout the pandemic and during our response to these protests just demonstrates your commitment as the leader of so many people to fight for what's right in our country. We are grateful, and I know that we're going to hear from Council Chairman Phil Mendelson, but I think that I could say for our entire leadership in Washington, D.C., thank you for advancing this. This means everything to the people of Washington, D.C.
The mayor has introduced him, but you know, I was president of the Maryland Senate a long, long time ago. And I suppose, Phil, you would be the president of the District of Columbia Senate, or the new states Senate. Ladies and gentlemen, the president of the Washington, D.C. City Council, Phil Mendelson.
Thank you, Leader Hoyer, and thank you, Speaker Pelosi. In January 2017, I went to Mexico City, the reason why I remark on that today is because I was invited to introduce myself and be a guest for a brief moment at their constitutional convention. When Mexico had its revolution in 1910, they set up a government, a new form of government that was modeled very much after our form of government, with a state capital which was a federal district that did not have representation in the national legislature. But a few years ago, maybe a half dozen years ago, the government of Mexico decided to change that structure and to give statehood to its federal district. And I was invited to speak very briefly at their constitutional convention, where they were hammering out what the Constitution for the new state of Mexico City would look like. Mexico could do it. In fact, every country in the free world has done it, except for the United States of America. Mayor Bowser spoke about how offensive it was, the militarization, if you will, of the district in the last several weeks by our president. What wasn't said, but which I want to remind everybody, was it was only a couple of weeks ago where our president said on TV, on national TV, that Republicans would be crazy to give the district statehood because it would mean more Democrats in the Senate. And I mention that because this is about citizenship. This is not, should not be about partisanship. The right to vote in the United States of America is not and should not be a partisan issue. Opponents grasp at any argument, and we've heard them over the years, that we have corruption. In fact, when we had the hearing before Representative Chairman Cummings, why not all the Republicans could talk about was a corruption in the district government. If corruption was a litmus test, there would be no state in the union. And we've taken care of our mess. Other arguments that we're too small or too urban. It actually reminds me of what I heard years ago about we suffer from the 3 twos, too liberal, too Democrat, too black. Those are not reasons to deny citizenship. Or that we're too reliant on the federal payment. Well, there was a federal payment back in the 1990s. There's hardly a federal payment today, less than $100 million, less than 1% of our budget. We're not reliant on a federal payment. We're entitled to full citizenship. It used to be we couldn't run our finances. We have one of the healthiest, fiscally healthiest governments of any state or city in the country. And in fact, as horrible as the current recession is, we're in a better position to withstand it than many of the states. We run our finances very well. It's not a reason to deny us citizenship. So perhaps it's that the Founding Fathers intended it to be this way, because I've heard that argument. So I looked at the Federalist Papers. They're not an easy read. And I kind of read and read and read, and I kept trying to find that discourse, that long discourse about how the Founding Fathers intended that the citizens of the District of Columbia should not have a vote in the national legislature. And I can't find that language. I can't find that discussion. I think it was an oversight. As Leader Hoyer mentioned, we are larger than several states, but size shouldn't be a factor either. H.R. 51 corrects an injustice. H.R. 51 is about ensuring that the citizens of the District of Columbia, citizens who are citizens of the United States of America, have the same rights and same privileges enjoyed by every American in the other 50 states. Again, I want to thank Leader Hoyer. I want to thank Speaker Pelosi. I want to thank our warrior on the Hill, Eleanor Holmes Norton. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
May I present you with something?
Sure.
This is a flag. We honor our flag, and we just did yesterday on Sunday, on Flag Day. This one contains 51 stars, and it is perfect.
Thank you. By our actions on the 26th, we will move forward to putting that 51st star on this flag. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, Sophie Kaplan with the Washington Times. I was wondering, since the protest, since the injustice you call in the CARES Act, have you spoken with people who previously opposed statehood, and have they changed their mind? What kind of conversations are you having with other members of Congress?
I have not had that, but obviously, as Eleanor Holmes Norton and others have observed, it obviously had a, whether it's the scheduling of this bill or whatever, we've had 3 senators who have added their names to the bill. That puts 40 senators. I'm sure we'll have a lot more than that. And I would hope and would echo President of the Council Mendelson's words, this is not about politics. If it is, we demean our democracy. If the criteria is whether you're a Democrat or Republican, should we exclude all the blue states, as the President would refer to them, from voting in the Congress of the United States? Was that a litmus test? I understand there have been politics throughout the years on states coming into the Union. But the fact of the matter, this is about who we are as a country. Do we believe in one man, one vote? One woman, one vote? Do we believe in equal representation? Was the Boston Tea Party message forgotten over the years? That we cannot be taxed without representation? That may not be the phrase when we become a state, but it is a phrase that is powerful and meaningful and was at the start of our country. That we did not want a government that took our money but did not allow us a say in how that money was spent. So I am hopeful that the answer to your question will be, there will be many who will repair to the 51st star. And they will do it certainly in the House, where we will pass this bill on the 26th, but also in the Senate. I hope that Senator McConnell cares enough about our democracy to allow a vote on this bill in the United States Senate. Not just to pigeonhole it, not just to say to 700,000 people, we don't respect you enough to even give you a vote in the United States Senate in which you do not have a vote. So I'm hopeful that we will move this forward, not only through the House of Representatives, but also the United States Senate.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on retrocession or possibly giving D.C. residents the right to vote in Maryland.
Well, you know, there was a congressman from Virginia, his name is Paris, who suggested that. There were some bills, by the way, and I unfortunately didn't bring with me. It was a great quote in a bill that was considered many years ago about doing exactly that in the 19th century. And a gentleman got up and said that he was thinking of voting for that because they would have a vote. And when I was confronted with that many, many years ago, in the 80s, I guess Paris suggested that again, I said, look, the citizens of Washington, D.C. want their own vote, not a vote of some other state, but their vote, their views being expressed, not Maryland's views, their views being expressed. And that's, so I reject that out of hand, as I did in the late 80s. I thought that was not an idea which would serve the voters of the people, not just the voters, the people of the District of Columbia, or our country's premise of each entity being sovereign within a United States of America. There's no reason why Wyoming, that has about 25–30% less people than the District of Columbia, would have 2 United States senators, and the 700,000 people, forget about the District of Columbia, and the 700,000 American citizens would be without representation in the United States Senate. Or, and I want to say this, there is nobody who does a more effective job than Eleanor Holmes Norton on behalf of her jurisdiction. And she does that without a vote. Now, she has a vote in committee, and she has a vote in the Committee of the Whole, which, by the way, I worked with her to get when I was Majority Leader in 2007, and the Republicans, when they took over in 2010, took it away. And when I became Majority Leader again, we gave it back. But that ought not to be the case, that it depends upon whether Democrats or Republicans are in charge. Politics, as President Mendelson mentioned, is not the issue. It is democracy that's the issue. Next.
Over here, sir. For Mayor Bowser, if you could come to the microphone, please.
Come on.
My question
We'll leave
is
the
whether
51-star flag right there.
My question is whether the increased momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement has now improved the prospects for D.C. statehood. What are your thoughts on the connection between the two?
Well, certainly race and the status of Washington, D.C. have been long connected. I think you also heard Phil mention that we are too Democratic, too black, too liberal, to this, to that. And so I think that confronting the issue of race in the DC statehood movement has always been a part of our discussion. I think what's also critical in the Black Lives Matter movement is that policymakers, especially in the position, and I know that the Democrats have advanced the bill here on policing and policing reform, and having experienced people in the Senate voting for us on those issues will represent Washington, D.C., which will be a critical part of that discussion.
Can I just add to what the mayor said? I don't think there's any doubt both the politics of the district and the racial makeup of the district have had an effect on some who would consider this outside the ambit of thinking about democracy and the equality of each and every one of our citizens, irrespective of artificial distinctions, which are real distinctions, but not relevant to whether or not somebody is voting and is a full citizen of our country. Next question.
Sure. I also have a question for Mayor Bowser, if I can. You
Sure.
touched on this a little bit earlier, but how important do you think the events of the last 2 weeks were for galvanizing and educating people in the rest of the country about the limits of DC's own ability to self-govern?
I think it's been hugely important. I remarked to one of my team this morning that I've been invited to speak at a number of places and to different audiences that we would not have been able to pay for advertising in. So we have definitely increased the reach. For example, I did the Late Late Show, where this comedian from England had the most wonderful questions and the most wonderful discussions about DC statehood with me. And I think he represented a lot of people. I posed a question to him. I said, do you know our congresswoman does not have a vote in the United States Congress? And he goes, no, I only learned that 2 days ago. And so that, to me, is a lot of Americans are in that place, and they don't like it. But that's what we knew. That's what our polling suggested, that when Americans know the issue of D.C. statehood, they support D.C. statehood. I also had an interview with Lil Wayne. That wouldn't have happened 2 weeks ago. But he has millions of followers, young people who are about justice and about doing something. And they want to reach out with various channels with people like us. And it's a big lesson, not just for DC statehood, but the conversation that we're having around police reform is that we have to go to our voters and the people that we represent in all different places around where they are. So that's a long answer to your question, but certainly we have been able to be in a lot of different platforms talking about the injustice of DC statehood and all of the things that the federal government can do to us in the current state. All of these things will be corrected with statehood, but even in advance of that, our Congresswoman has advanced bills, and I think some of them may be a part of the legislation, the various pieces that we are considering to make sure that the mayor of the District of Columbia has control of the DC National Guard, which is now a federal guard. This part of our home rule charter that allows the president to federalize our police force with some hurdles, but not huge ones, also needs to be addressed, and we're going to work on that. And finally, I know the Congresswoman has advanced a bill that would change our titles. And I haven't always been a big proponent of doing that because I don't want to give anybody the idea, if you call me governor, that we're a state, and we're not. But this is why I think it's important now. And that includes the members of the council would become, they would have a different title as well. It's because, I don't know about all Washingtonians, but when I heard all the talk during the pandemic about the governors are going to take care of it, the governors are going to go do this, the governors are going to do that, And I would sit there like, what are we, chopped liver, and 700,000 taxpayers who give more to the federal government than we get back? And that made a difference. We had to fight, my team, to make sure that on all of these calls where some of these decisions were being hashed out and made that were for the governors, that we got on those calls so that we would be in those discussions. So I fully support the measures that Congresswoman Norton is moving forward in advance of statehood, but statehood fixes it all, and now the American people have a clear idea of what can happen without it.
We're going to end, but I hope that every member of the Congress of the United States and every member of the United States Senate thinks to themselves, I've got a son or a daughter, or an aunt or an uncle or a neighbor, and they're asked to come to work in Washington, D.C. And if they move to the Washington, D.C. proper, they will be disenfranchised. They will be less equal citizens. What kind of a concept is that? That if I move to my nation's capital, I will be less of a citizen in America. I hope all of my colleagues think of that when they vote on this bill on the 26th and when it goes to the United States Senate. This is the right thing to do for our country, for what we believe in, for our Constitution, for our Declaration. All of us are created equal. 51 will take a step towards a more perfect union. Thank you. All right.